In this voiceover PowerPoint, we consider the new field of epigenetics, at one time an heretical idea at odds with widely understood precepts of Mendelian genetics, the structure and behavior of genes, and the accepted tenets of evolution and natural selection. And I suppose I can forewarn you that there is a moral to a kind of scary story. You may be surprised to know, or you might remember, that Darwin did not invent evolution. The idea that all species are related and descended over time from common ancestors had been around for many years. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck suggested a mechanism for evolution before Darwin. Like Darwin's, his mechanism of evolution was based on the influence of environment on heredity. The most familiar example of Lamarck's idea is that of the giraffe's neck. Why is this animal so tall? And why is so much of its height in its neck? Lamarck suggested that as giraffes kept depleting the low-hanging fruit that made up their diet, they would stretch their necks to get at higher fruit. Since longer necks were so useful, this character would be passed on to the next generation. In Lamarck's theory, the giraffe's longer neck is a purposefully acquired character. In fact, an improvement of the giraffe. Lamarck's ideas were discredited, to the point of ridicule, after Darwin provided a more creditable explanation for species diversity and ancestry, and after Mendel's discovery of paired genes were belatedly understood as the basis of inheritance and as the objects of change in evolution. The key difference between Lamarck's seemingly simplistic explanation and Darwin's theory of natural selection is that inheritance and evolution are entirely random. In the nature versus nurture argument, the environment simply chooses or selects between mutations that have already accumulated by chance and entirely without purpose. In the nature versus nurture argument, nature wins. Or does it? Here are some studies to think about. The first study came out of nowhere, or, to be more precise, out of Överkalix. That's a town in northern Sweden with remarkably precise and complete medical, agricultural, and social records of its citizens. Here's a table correlating the food supply of grandparents with the mortality of their grandchildren. Look closely at this table. If you're a male and your grandfather lived through famine in his teens, you would have had a 35% lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease or diabetes than the grandsons in the general population. On the other hand, if your grandfather lived through a time of abundance in his teens, you, the grandson, would have a 67% higher risk of dying from cardiovascular disease or diabetes. But look, if you're this guy's granddaughter, you'd have been safe, having the same risk of illness and death as granddaughters in the general population. You would not have been affected by the life your grandfather experienced. But wait, look at the last column in the table. It is, if anything, more dramatic for young women. You were much less at risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetic mortality if your grandmother lived her teen years at a time of want and famine. This looks like sex-linked inheritance, but a most odd inheritance at that. Not only does this look a lot like the inheritance of Lamarck's purposefully acquired characteristics, but the character has been passed down through not one, but 2 generations. Here's a second, more recent study. This one is a direct test of whether environmental factors can influence inherited characters in a purposeful way. First, pregnant female rats are exposed to vincozoline, a powerful fungicide. The rat pups grow up showing serious illness and abnormalities. The details aren't important here. When males from this mother mature and are mated to normal female rats that have never been exposed to the fungicide, both male and female pups born to this unexposed mother rat also suffer the same diseases and abnormalities as their father. What's more, when mated with unexposed females, males from this second mating can pass these traits on again, and this can be repeated for yet another generation. Eventually, though, repeated matings of descendant offspring resulted in normal rats, indicating that the effects of the fungicide on the first pregnant female rat, or pups in utero, were reversible. Therefore, these effects of vincozulin could not be traditional mutagenic effects. If vincozulin does not act on the genes of the first generation of sickly rat pups, what then were its effects? The seemingly purposeful passage of acquired phenotypes from one generation of rat pups to another is not based on genetic information in rat DNA, but in some way is imprinted on top of the DNA. This type of inheritance has been named epigenetic, literally meaning above genes. The above the genes changes that occurred in the overcalyx residents, in the fungicide exposed in utero pups, rat pups, and now in fruit flies and other experimental organisms, are changes in the expression of genes caused by chromatin and DNA modifications. These include then the chemical modification of DNA itself. In other words, the progeny rats were inheriting not altered genes, but altered chromatin and therefore altered patterns and timings of gene activation and repression, altered patterns of gene control. Here's just a reminder of how chemical modification of histones, acetylation in this case, causes decondensation of chromatin to its beads on a string or nucleosome structure. This change is reversible. So, what has been passed from one generation to the next is not altered genes, but altered controls on gene expression. These were induced in the germline of the pups and persisted until beyond the reproductive maturity of several rat generations. If not reversed, or if stabilized by environmental factors, such chemical modifications to DNA and chromatin proteins are durable and heritable. When they occur in the germline, that is sperm or eggs, they can be passed on and may take multiple generations before they are reversed. So was Lamarck right after all? No, the object of evolution is still your genes. But nurture indeed has a greater role in inheritance than we have thought for a long time. As the saying goes, the sins of the fathers can be visited on the sons, in this case by epigenetic inheritance. Overeating, smoking, and other bad habits will outlast you and may show up as illnesses and premature mortality in your children and grandchildren. As they say, a word to the wise. And that brings us to the end of this presentation.